Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Flourish FM. We're delighted to bring you today's conversation with Professor Angie Hobbs, classicist and philosopher with expertise on ancient Greek philosophy. She's Professor of the Public Understanding of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, and prior to this, she was Professor of the Public Understanding of Philosophy at the University of Sheffield. Her most recent book is Plato, Public, a Ladybird Expert Book, and she's a regular speaker on many major podcasts and TV programs and radio programs, including the BBC radio podcast In Our Time, which is also on BBC Radio 4. And she's spoken on many major TV programs and events all around the world, including in the UK House of Parliament, the Athens Democracy Forum, and the World Economic Forum. Today, we had a fantastic conversation with her. You're going to love it. Nick, what did you really enjoy about this conversation?
Yeah, she did all that beautiful stuff and then actually took time to sit down in the cellar with us for a little while, but that was great. So yeah, she was awesome. I really enjoyed kind of this. She really identified, like, when we talk about flourishing, it can't just be a me thing, it has to be a we thing, right? So these elements of social connection and how we need to think about flourishing, not just on an individual level, but flourishing as communities. And then I think that led her to chat a bit about, Eudaimonia or Eudaimonia, and which was a lot of fun for me, being a dissertation topic, but just the fulfilling our kind of greatest virtues, our greatest faculties, like living up to our potential, and then kind of what that means for character and ethics as well. So really interesting conversation.
Great. Thanks, man. Okay, here we have our conversation with Professor Angie Hobbs.
Hi there. Hi, Nick.
Hello. Nice to meet you.
Beautiful flowers.
I regarded buying flowers each week as part of my pandemic expenses. So I always, hang on, I'm just going to alter that slightly. Is it very naughty to have a couple of my book covers in the background?
No,
it's very appropriate.
It's expected.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to do this.
Well, thank you for accepting our invitation. We're delighted to have you here, an expert on human flourishing, particularly in the ancient world. And I mean, let's dive right in with that question. As an expert on human flourishing, how would you define human flourishing?
I define it as something more objective than happiness. So it's not so much about a subjective feeling of happiness, let alone a feeling of pleasure. To me, it is about the best actualization, the best fulfillment of our faculties. Okay. And those faculties could be all our faculties: intellectual, emotional, imaginative, physical.
Okay, so the fulfillment of all our faculties or some in particular?
I think all of them, for me. If you're asking me what I think flourishing is,
that's what we're just
all our faculties, yes.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper on that then. So,
But I did say the best actualization of all our faculties. We all have the capacity to behave very badly, so we need to come back to this word best at some point.
Yeah, is that let's maybe do that now. Is that best in terms of morally best, or to the highest standard, or a blend of the two?
The way that we can actualize our faculties, that we live the best life individually and for our communities, because the individual is part of the community. So of course there's going to be a moral dimension to that. It will mean looking at what kind of values and virtues are going to best help us fulfill those faculties.
Okay, fantastic. And obviously this is presumably going to be quite deeply inspired by ancient philosophy, particularly perhaps ancient Greek philosophy, on which you're an expert and a scholar. And I mean, this is where in ancient Greek philosophy is where flourishing, the concept of flourishing in Western thought finds its origins in the concept of eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness or flourishing. So let's get into kind of your expert view on that. What exactly is eudaimonia, and how do Plato and Aristotle's views on that differ? But also, how has this inspired your view of flourishing you just outlined there?
Wow, a lot of questions there. Okay, so let's
take them one at a time.
Let's start with Plato. So yeah, eudaimonia literally just means living under the guardianship of a beneficent guardian spirit, a beneficent daimon. It's more objective than a subjective notion of feeling happy. It might include feeling happy. It does a bit with Aristotle, less so with Plato, but it is much more objective. You can point to somebody across the street, you don't know how they're feeling that day, but you can say that person is living a eudaimon life. That person is eudaimon. And as we've just been discussing, it is very much about the best actualization of your best faculties. Now, in my interpretation, those faculties would very much include our physical faculties too. In Plato, not so much. Plato particularly concentrates on our psychic faculties, the capacities of our psyche, and he looks at three in particular. He looks at reason, which desires truth and reality. Then there's a second faculty, which is the spirited element in us, which desires success and honor and victory. And then we have our appetites for food, drink, sex, the money needed or possibly needed to acquire them. And for Plato, eudaimonia consists in the correct attunement of these faculties. It's the notion of the harmony of the psyche. He actually uses the phrase mental health, psychic health, for the first time that we know of in the West, at least. And I'm sure we'll come back to that notion of health. What does this mean in practice? For Plato, it means that our reason needs to be in control, that this kind of harmonious attunement of our psychic faculties can't happen unless our reason is in control, that our spirited element is supporting the decrees of reason, and our appetites are basically doing what they're told. Mm-hmm. And it's reason's job only to ensure, it's reason's job to ensure that we fulfill the best potential of all our three faculties. Now, what does best mean here? Clearly, $1 trillion word, and it needs reason to think very carefully about which desires of the spirited element and our appetites in particular should be fulfilled. Not every desire should be fulfilled in order for the best fulfillment, the best actualization of our faculties to take place. So we've got this notion of a tripartite psyche, with reason in control, aided and abetted by the spirited element, the appetites basically doing what they're told, reason aiming to fulfill the best potential of all three parts of the psyche. Mm-hmm. And if that happens, we have a situation where eudaimonia takes place, our human flourishing takes place, but also, says Plato, it's going to be the same psychic structure that amounts to our human virtue. He identifies justice in the soul, which is a very broad-ranging word in Plato. It basically means right conduct. And he says human justice, our individual justice, is the same psychic structure as our individual flourishing, our individual eudaimonia. So he, in practice, identifies virtue and flourishing. A pretty extreme view. I mean, he takes it to a very extreme levels. He says that even if you are wrongly accused of malpractice, if you're being tortured and put to death, you can still be a flourishing person if your virtue is intact, if your psyche is still in this harmony. Aristotle's going to say, no, that's nonsense. Goodness me, we need at least minimal physical satisfaction. But Plato takes this very extreme view. And too extreme for many, too extreme for me. I would rather have some of the physical faculties brought in there. However, there's so much about Plato's vision, which I think is incredibly rich, and I'm sure we will tease out as the conversation goes on, because firstly, this whole notion of mental health, this identification of our individual flourishing, our well-being, with our virtue, and that is our mental health. And that's been hugely influential throughout Western thought. It was very influential on Freud, so I'm sure that's something we'll want to discuss. Also, Plato says you can't do this on your own, or very, very few people, maybe Socrates, could achieve this flourishing on their own in a poor social and political environment. But most of us need the right kind of social, cultural, and political environment in order to acquire the kind of values, the kind of virtues which will enable us to flourish in this way. So Plato really focuses, as of course we know from his work, The Republic, on what kind of social and political structure is needed, what kind of education. Education, hugely important for Plato. And then there's this notion that and this is something that really appeals to me, that the basic ethical questions for Plato, as indeed they will be for Aristotle, are how should I live and what sort of person should I be? Really basic questions. Agent-centered, centered on the ethical agent rather than the ethical act. So it's about an agent, an ethical agent, a person living a whole life. It's a whole person living a whole life and shaping that life, styling that life, in the sense that you can see a life and a character in narrative terms, in terms which are capable of aesthetic evaluation. So you get this really close relationship in Plato between goodness and beauty, which I find very appealing. It's an approach to ethics, which, because it's looking at a whole person living a whole life, and it can respond to the complexities of our lived experience, which to me make this a more attractive approach to ethics than, say, a consequentialist approach, which looks simply at the greatest good of the greatest number in terms of actions performed, or a duty-based approach, such as you might get in Kant, which again looks what actions must not be performed, what are the right and dutiful actions to perform. So for me, this ethics of flourishing is immensely appealing. And again, it's been hugely influential, sometimes in quite controversial ways, for instance, in Nietzsche and Foucault. And as we'll see later, there are plenty of problems attached to it. But for me, it speaks to something very deep in me. I really respond to the connections that Plato makes, both between ethics and political and social theory, and between ethics and aesthetics.
So you brought us in so many great directions here, right? We threw a bunch of questions out and you threw back a bunch of threads that I'd really love to sort of pull on. So I want to walk us through a couple of these, give you a chance to respond, and then we'll move.
I know, and we've only done the first of John's questions because we've only looked at Plato. We haven't yet looked at the differences between Plato and Aristotle, or what we can learn from all this now. So we've just begun, yes.
Yeah, we have just begun, yeah. And I actually want to sort of pull on a different difference, which is, as I heard you describing, right, Eudaimonia or Eudaimonia. And by the way, we haven't had a chance to talk, but my dissertation was on this in classroom settings. But I'm looking at it from a more scientific perspective, right? And the way I heard you describe it, I thought, well, wow, that sounds in some way, shape, or form like hedonism. And this will sometimes get conflated in the science as well. In fact, there are plenty of scholars who will argue that there really isn't a difference, right? Now, I'm not one of them, but I would love if you would, for the would-be flourishers listening, if you would sort of tease out these, different aims. What's the difference between eudaimonia and hedonism in terms of some objectives? And then you've mentioned the different faculties. What are the different faculties besides the one you mentioned, which is physical, right? From your perspective, from Professor Angie Hobbs' perspective. We'll leave Plato for a minute.
Yeah. Right. So from my perspective, the different faculties would incorporate our intellectual, emotional, imaginative, and physical faculties, those four main groups. Now, is it the same as hedonism? It depends on how you define pleasure, of course, if hedonism is connected with hedonic pleasure. But if we normally interpret pleasure in terms of sensation, in terms of feeling pleasure. And if that's the case, then no. And in fact, the reason I first got interested in an ethics of flourishing and the concept of flourishing was precisely, and I can't remember which happened first, but I came across Nozick's pleasure machine in Anarchy State and Utopia. The idea, if you could be kind of plugged into a machine and you were going to feel non-stop pleasure forevermore, and you would never regret it once you'd been plugged into that machine, would you, in your current state, as you are now, agree to be plugged in? And I felt, oh, no, there would be just so much potential of human life would just not happen. There'd be so much that would remain unfulfilled. And also how inappropriate to be laughing gleefully with pleasure when you hear about things such as, I don't know, the invasion of Ukraine, or the new wave in the pandemic, or the dangers of climate change. There are times in our life when it is simply not appropriate or even possible to feel pleasure. But I think we can still flourish even in those hard times, because you can always say, how can I best use my faculties, my potential, to increase my well-being and the well-being of my community, even given these current difficult circumstances? So I would definitely want to make a very clear distinction between eudaimonia and pleasure. But also, when I started to think about the Nozick article, when I started to think about Nozick's pleasure machine, I felt that for me, I wanted to extend this experiment to a happiness machine as well. So, because we can feel happy when you're not necessarily feeling great physical pleasure, but you can still feel very content, very happy. But again, I didn't want a life where I knew I was always going to feel happy, no matter what was going on around me, no matter who was dying or in pain. And I felt that would be an impoverished life. And it would not be a rich life, and it would not be the best possible life that I could live. So I wanted to extend that experiment even to the subjective feeling of happiness. And I distinguish eudaimonia, flourishing well-being, even from happiness as well as pleasure. And at about the same time, I came across Plato's great dialogue, the Gorgias. And there's a character in the Gorgias called Callicles who starts off, he doesn't end here, but he starts off saying that the good is simply unqualified pleasure. Later on in the debate with Socrates, he is forced to admit that, in fact, he does qualify different kinds of pleasure and thinks that some are good and some bad, and he's not prepared to accept cowardly pleasures because he's all into being the big man. But again, I read that at about the same time, and again, it got me thinking, what's the relation between eudaimonia, pleasure? What do we really want from life? When we look back on our lives, what do we want to think we've achieved? And is it just that, I've felt pleasure all the time? No, not for me.
Well, and you mentioned a really important word here, which is richness. And that immediately popped into my head as you started to describe this pleasure machine. And this has been a pretty consistent theme in some of our other conversations. We had on Todd Kashdan of George Mason, who's written a book called The Upside of Your Dark Side, and really argues for psychological richness, distress tolerance, and things of that nature. And it's such I think a perfect segue to talking a little bit about some of these virtues and the relationship of virtue cultivation to eudaimonia. And I've heard you in past interviews describe 4 particular virtues that you think are critically important And just hearing your description there, it seems to me that these virtues are particularly necessary when we are feeling unpleasantness, right? When we are not in a state of pleasure. And they are, as I recall, and you please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm looking at my notes here, resilience, right? Mental agility, creativity or imagination, as you said, and empathy. Will you kind of connect these dots a little bit more for us between eudaimonia, some of these virtues, and navigating unpleasantness?
Yes, I mean, those were 4 sets of values and virtues that I thought were particularly important right now in these very turbulent times. In that talk, I was particularly looking at what kind of virtues we need in a pandemic, but you could add climate change, you could add massive political instability and threats to democracy, you could add Black Lives Matter and fights for social justice. So we are clearly living in really stormy seas at the moment. What are we going to hang on to? And for that, again, is another reason I am so attracted to an ethics and politics of flourishing, because that gives you a secure framework, an overall notion of what it means to live a full, rich human life, both for yourself and your community. Now, the canvas in that frame will vary a bit from community to community, from age to age. The picture will vary a bit. It's not one picture which is going to exist for all time, but the framework needs to be solid. And I argued that particularly in stormy times, you need these 4 sets of virtues and associated values to build and construct and maintain this solid framework. Yes, so of course we need resilience. My goodness me, never more so. But that is connected to agility. Now, you might think, oh, they don't go together. You know, if you're going to be resilient, aren't you just like the oak in the storm and you stay strong and stable forever? Well, no, not necessarily. If new situations emerge, if let's hope not, but if a new variant of COVID emerges, if things get even worse on the Ukraine, in Ukraine or in former Eastern Europe, we need agility, we need adaptability, we need to be able to take in new information very fast, accept it, not be in denial of it, and think really quickly, how do we adapt to this? And that adaptability is part of the resilience. But again, so is the creativity, because having accepted the new reality, the maybe worse reality, and taken that on board and faced up to it with courage, with resilience, you don't just need agility to analyze it and understand what's going on. You also need imagination and creativity to think, how do I respond? And these are all virtues that I believe philosophy can help instill, engender, and foster. Philosophy, we know it's really good at critical analysis and the conceptual analysis, the analysis of deductive and inductive arguments and so on. But philosophy is also fabulous for fostering our imagination, because it forces us to look for counterfactuals, to invent different scenarios, to look at different possible outcomes, to imagine a world where people live and think and believe differently from how they may do in our own particular postcode. So again, that creativity is needed. And of course, we need compassion. We need, if we've got the imagination to understand different possible scenarios, that imagination is also going to be needed so we can help work out what impact the different scenarios are going to have on different groups, on different people, and feel their pain and think, well, no, we can't take route A out of this tragedy, we can't take route A out of this very difficult situation because the impact on this particular social group is just too high. So they all, to me, work together, and they're always needed, even when life is going well. But when life is going badly, my goodness, we need them. So, and to this extent, though I don't by all means agree with everything Plato or Aristotle says, and we'll come back to that later, I think they are absolutely right to say that a flourishing life and a virtuous life, they may not be as identical as Plato likes to paint, but they're very, very closely intertwined. So we need to think not just about what does a flourishing life look like, but what values and virtues are needed to help create it and maintain it and to stay strong when things get tough.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Really, really well said. As you were describing all of these, my thoughts were these all seem connected to underlying levels of optimism. They all seem connected to hope, right? And the ability to sort of weather the storm, right? Not just be that oak, but be agile. I love your mention of counterfactuals. And there's just so many interesting relationships we can tug on here. And maybe we'll be able to come back to them. For now, I want to take us on a slightly different turn. You mentioned something earlier that John and I really want to dig into with you. I'll often use the phrase with people that we don't flourish in a vacuum, right? And our strengths aren't recognized even in a vacuum, right? The environment, the ecosystem around us matters. You've sort of raised this, what I think could be a tension between community values and virtues, or maybe an individual's values and virtues. Ideally, those are sort of harmonious and aligned. Oftentimes they're not. Would you tease out that tension or potential tension a little bit more and talk about how you think someone might navigate that if they do find themselves in a community where values are misaligned? How might that impact their sense of eudaimonia? How might that impact their ability to cultivate virtues that they find valuable, maybe if the community around them does not?
Now, you've got two kinds of tension here, haven't you? You've got a tension between the selfish individual who thinks they're going to live the best possible life if they just concentrate on their own wealth, on their own power. Let's look at that individual first. But then we've also got a tension between, supposing you're basically a good individual, but in a corrupt society. And so maybe your values shouldn't be aligning with that very corrupt society. So it can work two ways around. So let's look at, first of all, at a selfish and rather bad individual who's living in a basically good society. Let's start there. Now, again, I think Plato is so helpful here. So in both Callicles in his Gorgias and in Thrasymachus in Republic Book 1, he gives us, they're slightly different views, but they both basically give us views of human flourishing based on the view that flourishing consists in the accumulation and display of material wealth and in power over others, and in the kind of freedom from constraint by other forces that gives you power over others. And I think brilliantly Plato shows that this is, again, to use the terminology we've been using, this is a very impoverished, this is not a rich view of what a human life can be. This is fundamentally, Plato says, to misunderstand what it is to be a human being. They are just simply looking at the human psyche in terms of the appetites for food, drink, sex, material wealth and goods, and also that we talked about the spirited part of the soul, which wants success and victory. It's ambitious, but they've directed that ambition onto the wrong thing because they're not guided by reason. The other two parts of their psyche have gone astray and are latching onto the wrong goods and are living this really thin life. They might think they're rich, but they're actually really poor. And their lives are fairly pointless. And that's, I think, really an interesting way to look at it. But then you've got the person.
Can I just jump in here really quick?
Yeah.
What you're saying is resonating so much because it takes me back to some of the studies I've seen. Because you mentioned this appetite. We come back to hedonism, and all I could think of there is the studies that sort of suggest that this hedonic life, this hedonistic focus, oftentimes will not correlate or has really no statistical connection to overall life satisfaction and fulfillment. And what I hear you saying is a potential lack of meaning, a lack of depth, a lack of richness, right?
It's a lot of
only
purpose.
about the pursuit
yes.
a lack of purpose.
It's very interesting. So often when people are asked, what do they want to feel? People say, I want to feel my life has some meaning, that there's some purpose to be existing on the planet. I was born, I'm going to die, I'm here conscious for a bit. What does it mean? And whether some people look to religion to provide meaning, not everybody feels able to do that. But one of the reasons I'm so attracted to an ethics and politics of flourishing with its roots in ancient Greek philosophy, is because it can help give shape. We've been talking about shape, narrative structure, meaning to a life, to a character, whether or not you look to a particular religion or not. It's an approach to ethics that can work both with all the world's major religions, but also without religion. And a lot of the work I do actually is with churches on interfaith dialogue and faith-secular dialogue, and whether a reworked, revitalized ancient Greek ethics of flourishing can help reduce current tensions. And it's such a fabulous resource because it provides a means for dialogue and discussion to take place between people of very different religious beliefs, but they don't feel they're being threatened because they're using debates and arguments and images from 2,500 years ago, before any of the world's, before obviously Christianity and Islam arose. There was Judaism, of course, but it was not particularly, as far as we know, it was not referenced at all in the ancient Greek philosophers I'm talking about. It wasn't until many years into the Common Era that Jewish thought started to interact closely with ancient Greek philosophy. So hugely helpful, and it's a safe space, if that makes any sense, that people don't feel threatened, and yet they can talk about very deep ideas. And it's a wonderful resource. It's a resource for the whole world. I passionately believe that ancient Greek philosophy is a global resource. I'm not saying we should go back to those times, of course not. There was slavery, conditions for women were bad, there were lots of problems. We don't want to go back to ancient Greece, but there's so much we can learn.
Well, thank you so much for these incredibly rich answers to Nick's questions here, Angie. And there's so much I'd like to continue, so many threads, as Nick put it, I'd like to also continue pulling on here, but particularly something you've just said there before we proceed further. What you just said about the ethics and politics of flourishing being something that's so important now and doesn't require any particular religion to be attached to any form of religious belief. The Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, they engage in this very wide study of the areas of life that contribute towards human well-being, and identify 4 pathways to flourishing. So areas of life that significantly enhance each of the areas of well-being. Identify areas such as happiness and life satisfaction, and good social relationships and character and virtue. And those 4 areas are family, work, education, and religious community. And it seems to me one of the challenges we face in research and well-being and flourishing is to, as it were, whether we can have a kind of a pathway to flourishing that is outside of religious community, but maintains all the benefits that religious community has, this wider sense of meaning, this close connection with others and so on, what we can learn from religious communities and religion that can help us flourish without, just saying to people, hey, just become religious. That's the way you can flourish, because that isn't advice that everyone wants to receive, right? So just connecting with the thing you've just said then, about how the ethics and politics of flourishing is a kind of a non-religious space that can really enhance well-being. Perhaps you didn't put it in those terms, but perhaps can enhance well-being. Do you think that this has a place in today's world as something that people can adopt in a kind of a secular world as a way of enhancing their well-being more broadly and encouraging interfaith dialogue as well?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yes, we can get so much of the benefits of religious community and honor them and adapt them. One doesn't have to be religious oneself to learn from and many of the benefits that religious community offer. So absolutely, I think that the ethics and politics of flourishing can be used in atheistic and agnostic settings, but also in religious settings. I mean, a lot of the people I discuss with have very profound religious belief, and they still think it can be helpful. I would want to go back to the 4 pathways that you mentioned. I'm sure, I know Plato for a start would want to say, well, we need to rethink family, because in the Republic, very controversially for the 2 guardian classes, he gets rid of the nuclear family. Now, again, I don't endorse that, but we do have to recognize that we also need to think very broadly and imaginatively. That word again, imagination, not just about what religious community might mean or how it might be adapted, but what family might mean, because not everybody has a close blood family. Some people do, but their families are awful and they want to escape them. They've been abused by their family. They've needed to escape. So, but there can be different kinds of families. So I think what we're looking here are different kinds of social connection. Different kinds. It could be with individual friends, but it could be with groups that we are friends or close neighbours that we regard as our family. Work colleagues, again, we share certain objectives, ideals. They can be regarded as a different kind of community we're in interaction with. And then either a religious community or a community based on a very strong set of beliefs. So I myself am agnostic, but I get a lot of comfort from working for various goals that I feel very strongly about. I work with various charities, particularly Refugee Tales, about the plight of refugees and asylum seekers, and we're all trying to improve the UK law in respect of ending indefinite detention. I get a lot of purpose and meaning in my life. That's just one example from working with them, with various environmental programs. My daughter's not religious, but is very, very passionate about green concerns, gets a lot of strength from those groups. So I think what I'm hearing from that Harvard program that you mentioned are connections with different kinds of community, overlapping communities. And this is interesting. We've not yet really discussed Aristotle and his, I'm sure we will, and his notion of eudaimonia. But as we know, for Aristotle, friendship is absolutely crucial, both in the building as a crucial building block in an individual flourishing life, but also in the life of the polis. It's absolutely crucial as both as a constituent of a good life, but also as a platform for displaying certain virtues such as justice and generosity, for building trust in a state. And we worry about, we rightly worry about what Aristotle says about friendship, because of course we rightly worry about the potential for corruption and nepotism. But there's also a lot to be learnt from what he says, that a real community and a really good life just for the individual is to a large extent formed from these overlapping communities that we feel associated with. So I think there's a lot in what you're telling me about the Harvard program, but I would want, from my perspective, from my ancient Greek perspective, I would want to say, let's be imaginative about what family means now and what religious community means. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And I think that's a really important point you've made. I mean, I should say it's it's based on existing research on well-being, and what that research shows is about the major factors that contribute towards enhancing well-being over time, and family, marriage, for example, having children is one of those areas. But I absolutely think that you're right, and it's a very important point you've made to think about, well, what does family really mean? Because of course one can call their aunt or their uncle someone who's not a blood relative, right? And so on. Yeah. Family, as Wittgenstein pointed out, with the notion of family resemblance concepts, family is not a clear term, right? It has many items of families, and the role that friendship can play in flourishing, I think, is a super important area to explore. And I'd love to discuss this more with you now. And this connects quite nicely with one of the areas of your work that Nick and I were looking into ahead of this interview. So you did an interview with Cabinet magazine, which I really enjoyed reading. And on that, that's part of where you've written and spoken on the importance of friendship in ancient Greek thought to flourishing. And in that interview, you observed that, I'm going to quote you here if you don't mind. You've read it more recently than me, so yes. Yeah, I've made a note of a couple of quotes here. So, quote, "The Greek notion of ethics clearly allows space for friendship as a necessary constituent of a good flourishing life and as crucial in moral and intellectual development," end quote. And you also say, quote, "Aristotle clearly says, and Plato can be read as implying, that we need friendships in order to actualize our faculties to be fully human. It's not that we need them in some immediate practical way, but rather to flourish fully as human beings in all our moral and intellectual capabilities," end quote. And just for listeners, we'll share a link to this in the show notes. So what do you think the role of friendship is in human flourishing? And what can we learn from Plato and Aristotle about friendship's role in how we lead flourishing lives?
Yes, they both analyze different kinds of friendship. Plato in the Lysis talks about attraction of like for like, attraction of opposites for opposites, but what he seems to privilege most is the attraction of a good person for a good person, not because they're alike, but because they're delighting in enjoying each other's goodness. Aristotle seems to reach a fairly similar conclusion. Again, he looks at the kinds of friendships that arise out of utility. We just need each other, or through shared activity. It might be sport, it might be work. But again, he also privileges the friendship of a good person for a good person because we're delighting in their goodness. It's enjoyable in itself. It enriches life in itself, but it also is a means by which we can exercise compassion, generosity, justice, fairness. But also there's so much even intellectually, we need friendship for at least part of our intellectual journey. They both say that. Both Plato and Aristotle say that. So even if at the very final pinnacle in Plato's intellectual ascent that he describes, we are viewing the form of the good or the form of beauty on its own. We need to start doing philosophy with others, in dialogue, through debate. And if we're on good and friendly terms with those others, then that debate will be much more collaborative and much more productive. So Plato makes a really clear distinction, which I think actually is very relevant to current conditions in the world, distinguishing the philosopher from the sophist. Sophists just seek to win arguments by whatever means possible, even if it means making the weaker argument appear the stronger. They're just out for victory. But the philosopher is searching for truth, and unless they're very, very advanced up the philosophical mountain, it is much easier to search with other people in dialogue, in debate, through Socratic question and answer. And if you're on friendly terms, then it will be a much more productive conversation. And Aristotle, again, says fairly similar things. It may be that ultimately we connect with his notion of God as pure thought thinking itself, and we do that on our own. But on the whole, he says, even if our final vision of the perfect philosopher is something that happens when they're on their own, nearly all the time, he says, this is at the end of the Ethics, his book, The Ethics, we need others to help us because we're too frail. As humans, we just don't have the stamina, the the resilience, the intellectual energy to manage all this by ourselves. So not only do we need friendship just to make life enjoyable and rich and to exercise the virtues of character, such as justice and generosity, but we also nearly always need friendship to exercise the intellectual virtues. We need these communities of friends, an idea, of course, that's later going to be taken up in the Hellenistic period by Epicurus, and in different ways by the Stoics, this notion of a community of friends, even to achieve real progress in philosophy. So, and again, that recognition of human frailty, but it's a frailty that can also be viewed as a strength. It's not needing other, recognizing that you need other people to help you on the journey. Is that recognition is itself a strength, I think.
So much positive there, and it also made me kind of come back to our earlier conversation. This sort of intellectual growth and the potential for debate, and it's so much easier when it's with friends. And then I also have the thought, yes, and sometimes it's harder. Sometimes friends don't want to cross those lines with each other. And it made me think of what we talked about earlier, the virtue cultivation of being resilient, being mentally agile, experiencing the distress of maybe kind of being a little uncomfortable with a friend, right?
Yeah.
Like knowing that there's some psychological safety and it's ultimately a safe space, but you're navigating these uncomfortable waters for a larger purpose, right? And to grow and to develop some of these virtues.
I think
and a deeper sense of character.
I think if you're a real friend, and this could be for a human being or it could be for your country, but if you're a real friend, you will have the courage, politely but clearly, to point out when you think your friend or your country or your organization, whatever you're connected with, is taking a wrong path. And because if you're a real friend, you want the good of the other person or the good of your country or the good of your organization. And you want that more than their approval of you and them just liking you. And if you're putting being liked and not ruffling feathers ahead of helping another person or your business or your country, then you're being a bit selfish. You're thinking about yourself. You just want to be liked. And that's egotistical, and it's lazy, and it's cowardly. The real friend will say what needs to be said.
Yeah. So how does all of this, because you've used this word multiple times, I'm very interested in this. How does all of this jive with a sense of harmony, right? Bringing all of these different parts of ourselves sort of into harmonious alignment, maybe, right? Where you've got these, I'm trying to kind of satisfy these appetites, but sometimes I'm experiencing distress and I've got to be resilient and mentally agile. And because harmony seems to me to suggest that we're sort of in line. The psychological word might be coherence, right? That your character and your behavior is sort of in line.
Yes.
How you envision yourself to be or how you hope to be, right? How do you think of harmony? Can you sort of wrap that up for us a bit?
Yes, it's about integrity of psychic integrity of character, that the different aspects of yourself are in tune, are at peace with each other, they're in alignment, they're not fighting each other, you're not fragmenting. And this was the aspect that so interested Freud when he talks about the passages in Plato's Republic. In fact, I'm so sad I know it's 444 in the Republic, when I think it's 443 to 444, when he first brings in this notion of psychic harmony and says it's a kind of mental health. And what Freud takes from this is we're talking about a personality that is one and not many. And indeed, Plato uses that phrase himself, that we are one and not many. We're not fragmented, we're not fractured. Because of that way, all sorts of psychological disturbances and indeed mental illness lie. I mean, look at schizophrenia. We are literally split in schizophrenia. So that for me is really important. But I really like the fact that Plato uses this musical terminology. For me, that's very a rich way of looking at it. Now, we should be clear here that the ancient Greeks don't have our concept of complex harmony. So when Plato uses a musical terms, and he means it to be a musical term in terms of harmonization and creating harmony, it's much more what we would call being in tune. It's about attuning the notes on the scale. And okay, so let's get so metaphorically, it's still perfectly accurate to talk in terms of musical harmony for Plato's theory. And it's about, again, styling a life. You're creating yourself and your life as if you were a work of art, and a work of art that's both good and beautiful. And what is it that makes it good and beautiful? It's the integrity of it. It's the authenticity of it. It's the purpose and meaning of it. So though Plato is quite deliberately using musical similes in the Republic for attuning the different faculties in the psyche, I think he's right to do that. And it's not just a metaphor. He really wants us to think about these aesthetic potentialities and the relationship between goodness and beauty, which is very deep, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. This connection here with music and the mind and music and living a flourishing life in particular. Earlier on, you said something very striking. I want to take us off on a slightly different tangent here about flourishing having a dark side.
Oh, yes.
Which is extremely important for us to explore. It's widely regarded that to flourish is many people regard it as the ultimate aim of life and what we should, the ultimate pursuit, the ultimate end in itself, if you like, the thing that we should all pursue for its own sake. That's, for example, as Aristotle argues, as you pointed out. But the idea that has a dark side is fascinating. So could you elaborate further on what you mean by this?
I think there are several ways in which, particularly as we see it in Plato and Aristotle, it can have a dark side. So firstly, because for both of them, it's an objective notion to do with the fullest actualization of our human faculties, they take this actualization in terms of the faculties of the species as a whole. And they think that some people are able to actualize faculties better than others because some people are born with more rational potential than others, so they think. And indeed, of course, there are people who are born with various kinds of disabilities or physical disabilities and so on. So they have a hierarchy of flourishing, which I find very disturbing. And in Aristotle, it's males at the top. With Plato, it's a few males and a few females at the top, but a lot of other men and women lower down. And alas, they both think that there are natural slaves who are not born with sufficient rational capacity to run their own lives. So I find that hierarchy of flourishing deeply disturbing. Is there a way out of it? I think there is. And this is why I always say I want to try to rework an ancient Greek ethics of flourishing for the 21st century, not just go back to it. You can do it, I think, or the way to start doing it is saying, no, we're looking at the flourishing of the individual. How can each individual best actualize whatever capacities they have in whatever social and political and cultural circumstances they find themselves? What is the best life for that individual, given all their particular contingent complex circumstances? And that, I think, is one way forward to so get rid of the notion of an objective notion of a species flourishing and to look still pretty objective, but in terms of the individual in their particular set of circumstances. And that, I think, helps quite a lot. There's also, of course, a worry, and this is certainly this worry became a reality in Plato's dialogue, The Republic, is that if you think that some people do not have very good reasoning ability, you will think, as the character of Socrates says in Plato's Republic, that for some people it will be better for them, that they will have more well-being if their lives are run by other people, people who have better intellect by nature, or better education, better trading, better experience, the philosopher rulers of the Republic. So it can also tend to, in a very authoritarian, indeed, and paternalistic direction, which again, I would want to reject completely. Is there a way we can work our way out of that problem? Sorry, is there a way that we can tackle that problem? Again, I think there is. I think it's about building notions of Kantian autonomy and agency into what it means to flourish and what it is to actualize your faculties, that this is something you need to be doing nearly always for yourself, running your own life, being an autonomous agent. So there's too much to go into in great detail here, but I think it is possible to take an ethics and politics of flourishing, which does not have to end up going down an authoritarian or paternalistic route. And that's by building a notion of autonomy into what you think it is for an individual to flourish. There are other problems. As we've seen, Plato identifies flourishing and virtue. Great, we think. He also identifies both with mental health. Initially, we think great, and Freud, as we've seen, is very interested in that. There's lots of positives there. But also, of course, if you're going to identify virtue with mental health, then that means vice is identified with mental illness. And again, you've got massive potential for political and medical exploitation and abuse of that, because people who annoy you in a state, political dissidents, for instance, as in Stalinist Russia, can be accused of being mentally ill and shipped off to some corrupt sanatorium for a lobotomy or whatever. And you get the scenario, many of us will have seen the brilliant film or read the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So you don't want a situation where virtue and health and vice and illness are identified in ways which doctors, psychiatrists, politicians can abuse. So there are real problems which we need to guard against. And we don't do the notion of flourishing justice if we adjust everything in the garden is rosy about it. We have to be aware of the dangers and how historically it is a concept that has often been abused and has often led down pretty authoritarian, indeed sometimes totalitarian routes by right-wing or left-wing extremists. So we need to watch out.
It's such an interesting sort of web of connection you're weaving for us here, and a complicated and intricate dance. I think autonomy, right, as a core need, we know for I think most human beings, frankly, kind of, this sense of individualism, while understanding that that's in many ways very cultural, right? We had David Johnson on earlier, and he talked about, differences a lot of times between various cultural orientations towards flourishing and well-being that are more communitarian and meaning-based as opposed to individualistic or happiness-based, right? Trying to figure out how to thread the needle, so to speak, with some of these different things. And it comes back to this. Go ahead.
There's one thing I wanted to add to the possible dangers, or at least tendencies we need to be alert to. And you've just mentioned communitarianism, and it can apply here, though it doesn't have to, is that we've talked about how it's an ethics that's based on the questions, how should I live? What sort of person should I be? In Plato in particular, he's interested in the spirited element of our psyche, which wants success, which wants honor. That means it's an approach to ethics that's going to lead us to look for role models and life models. Because how do you get honor in your community? Well, emulate a character, whether historical or fictional, who's already honored. So it tends to privilege the notion of role models and life models. And we see that in communitarianism too. That can be great. And again, I find that it's often rich, it's helpful, it links in with the whole notion of the narrative structure that we've been talking about. But a role model culture will tend to be very conservative with a small c. By nature, you are replicating what's already there. Now, Plato is aware of this, and that's why in the Republic, because he doesn't like the role models on offer in Greek society and Homer and so on, he just rips it all up and starts again from kind of year zero in this very radical new vision of an ideally just state. I don't agree with his vision in many ways, but he's completely correct to recognize the conservative tendencies of this approach to ethics, and ethics of flourishing, and a politics of flourishing, and how that needn't be a bad thing, but we need to recognize that sometimes we are going to need to establish new traditions, new role models, as indeed we're seeing around the world at the moment. We're getting, some fabulous new role models are coming along, and a lot of them are teenagers and 20-somethings. So it's not necessarily a problem so long as one is aware that an ethics and politics of flourishing will tend to replicate itself, unless you're alert to that and are prepared sometimes to say, right, our existing role models and traditions are not good. Mm-hmm. They are not healthy. We need to start again. And again, that can be an issue with communitarianism in somebody like MacIntyre, who I think would not want to endorse those dangers himself, but his work in, After Virtue, it can, whether he wanted that or not, I think not, but it can tend in a very conservative direction.
Thank you so much for your response, Angie. This has been such a rich conversation. Our final question today is one we like to ask all our guests, and we call it the flourishing question.
Yes.
What's the one lesson on flourishing you want our listeners to walk away with, and what might be a practical step to putting that lesson into action?
Sorry, long pause here.
Yeah, we're ending with bangers.
We can't wait.
Time, it's a tough one. Building the suspense.
Every day, no matter how difficult your situation, no matter how challenging, there is always something that you can do with the faculties that you have, intellectual, emotional, imaginative, physical, to improve your situation a bit and to improve the situation of the community or world around you a bit. I'll say that again. I'll say it again.
Oh, I loved it.
Because it's actually nearly always something. But anyway, I mean, it's okay. If you want something really punchy, we'll go with always something you can do.
So I just texted John. I said, "There's our promo quote." So I actually thought it was perfect.
Okay,
that's the social media clip.
I've got to go. It's been a joy and a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Professor Angie Hobbs, for joining us today. This has been absolutely fascinating. Learned so much about your work and about ancient Greek thought, Plato and Aristotle, and really interesting, themes really important for us to be thinking about human flourishing, such as its dark side. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
I have a website, angiehobbs.com, and that is kept reasonably up to date. And it also has my sort of Twitter handle and so on it. So that would be the best place to start. And it's also got recent publications, TV and radio programs, other podcasts and so on. But thank you. I would just want to thank you, both of you, because thank you for inviting me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I feel very honoured to be invited onto this series, and I've really enjoyed our discussion. So thank you.
As have we. Thank you so much, Angie.
So,
you enjoy the rest of your day.
And I wish a flourishing life to all your listeners.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yep. Take care.
See you soon, Angie.
Bye now. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Take care. Huge thanks to all of you for listening to today's show.
If you like what you heard, please share it with friends, family, colleagues, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review. You can also find us on all social media platforms. We've got our own YouTube channel, and you can check out our website at flourishfmpodcast.com.
We'd also love to hear from you. There's a survey in the show notes you can complete, where you can complete any suggestions on guests you'd like to hear us interview, or particular topics or themes you'd like to hear us talk about. We'd love to hear your feedback on that, so your feedback would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out that form. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us today.
And keep putting in the work.